Is there regulation that prevents working with vendors that have specific data ownership rights?
I think I can only go on my own experiences, but for me it was, with one particular tool we were using, it was the sampling of data that was the problem. So that sampling of data would undermine me in important meetings with senior management, where well, how can you trust the data? Because we're not getting the full extent of it, and then the numbers would not match up with another system. And then that comes back to the fact that you then want to question those numbers, and then there's nobody on the end of the phone to help you with that. So I could get myself into some pretty difficult situations by just not being able to stand behind the numbers with confidence. And I think that's the problem when something is never truly free, because they have to constrain the service that they provide in order for it to be sustainable.
I think that plays again to the deployment and to the structure and the rigor you put in the setup, whether it's free or even a paid solution. If that rigor is not put in at the outset, the risk of not being able to fully have the confidence in the data is quite critical. But again, on the regulation side, how is it impacting? I guess there's a lot more questions, a lot more, and again it comes back to that level of due diligence that certainly again in financial services and in other sort of regulated industries, some of that due diligence was already there. So there was already certain regulations around data privacy and protection within pharmaceutical or within financial services. So for those areas, this is just a sort of stronger controls over already quite good foundations. With some of the other areas, like e-commerce and things, where some of those controls maybe weren't in place to the same level, there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of uncertainty. And free solutions, well, again, I think even paid solutions, I think it's fair to say everyone is trying to have their spin or their understanding on certainly on new regulations coming out and what they're doing to control those.
I think it's about having a relationship with the vendor, though, in the context of the GDPR. The regulation we're referring to that's coming in May next year, is it's not just about the data controller, i.e. the controllers within the organisation, it's also about how that data is processed. So therefore many organisations are now looking at their relationships with third-party vendors. And often when you look at free tools, you're signing up online, you're agreeing to their T's and C's online. There isn't a legal team that you're negotiating terms with. So in the context of financial institutions or security organisations of the like that Alex and I have worked for, they're really looking strongly at how they manage their relationships with their vendors post GDPR to make sure that the data is managed in the appropriate way and handled in the appropriate way. And that's very difficult to do with a faceless vendor that you've signed up to online.
Might not even be in the same country.
Exactly, that doesn't understand the local laws. Maybe they're not truly a global organisation in that regard, and you're signing up to what predominantly might be US T's and C's. So I mean, neither of us are lawyers, so it's a good idea for anybody to run this by their legal team.
So US T's and C's as well would potentially have problems if it's GDPR, right? Because GDPR is a European piece of legislation.
Well, I think that some of the US companies are sort of aware of GDPR and will be putting things in place. But again, some of the specific local entity laws, so like the laws in Germany, for example, are slightly different to in the UK, and they have certain, and Switzerland again have slightly different controls. Some of these boilerplate agreements may not take into consideration the differences within Europe versus the US versus Europe. So I think it's difficult without having them to be able to pick up the phone or to sort of get legal involved. And I guess that's one of the issues that I've faced through a number of clients is free software. They are really easy to sign up to. It's free, of course it is. But how many people read the T's and C's? And if you're in the marketing department and go, I really need a tool, well, it's free, I'll sign up. Have you read the T's and C's? Check. Yes, I have. Have you? Probably not. Has legal seen it? Yeah, probably not. And then trying to get control around that once that horse has already bolted, that's, I guess, from a compliance and the legal side of your business, that's where they then struggle.
In a financial institution, can free software be considered, Alex? And if not, why is that?
I think it can still be considered. I think it's down to the institute's kind of risk appetite and the dialogue that they can have with those tools. Again, whether it's free or whether it's enterprise, I think the key thing there is the governance and the conversation you can have as two businesses. Enterprise solutions will nearly always provide you with a contact that you can talk and get an agreement that both parties are happy with. Free solutions are not always as flexible. For some free tools, whether you're the world's biggest brands or the flower shop down the road, you'll be signing up to the same set of conditions. And for some enterprises, that risk and that level of flexibility is just not acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Is there regulation that prevents working with vendors that have specific data ownership rights?
Not yet, I think, not to that extent, but there will be, of course, with the GDPR that's coming in May 2018, because the GDPR covers not only the data ownership, as in the owners of the business, but it also covers the processing of that data. So that does mean that involves the vendors, whether they're free or paid. Organisations are going to start looking at the contracts with those vendors. So going back to Alex's point earlier, if you've just signed some T's and C's, how much influence do you have on the ability to change those T's and C's? So therefore your reliance on being compliant with this legislation that's coming in next year then falls to how well that vendor manages it. And I'm not sure that, particularly in the financial sector or security companies, that's going to be acceptable.
I think within financial services and pharmaceutical, in some of those industries where there are regulations, there may be some regulations that will prevent some tools from being acceptable. I think, as you said, the GDPR applies that sort of level of rigour to a wider range of industries and online solutions. So again, I think it will depend on where you're coming from, and it will come down to, as Jen said, it's the willingness to enter into dialogue in terms of what the tool can and can't do and the flexibility of those tools.